Hi, it's Pastor Andy again with our discipleship video for Tuesday this week, and this one is about being acceptable to God. My focus on Sunday was mainly Romans 15:14, if you happen to see that message or were here on Sunday. In that verse, Paul talks about the fact that he is satisfied with his brothers and sisters there in the church at Rome. And a similar idea, of course, to being satisfied with something is to think of it as being acceptable. Now, being satisfied could mean far more than just being acceptable. Well, that's okay, would be acceptable, whereas satisfied, oh, I really enjoyed that. But at least there's some similarity there. And what we find, though, is that that word, acceptable, this idea of being accepted and acceptable has been mentioned a few times in a fairly short amount of time in Paul's writing here. In Romans 15:16, Paul uses the word acceptable. Again, in verse 14, he uses satisfied, but in 16 here, he uses the word acceptable. The word that is used there as acceptable is the same general form of the word. It's not the exact same word, but it's the same form of the word that we find in Romans 12:1, Romans 12:2, and in 14:18. And when I say the same form of the word, I mean in the original language. In English, it's obviously the same here. But the important idea in each of these uses is that it is God who finds the people acceptable, not Paul. Now, verse 14, Paul was satisfied. Paul found them acceptable. But in these other verses, it is God who either we are seeking to have him find us acceptable or who does find us acceptable. In Romans 12:1, for instance, we are commanded to offer ourselves as a sacrifice that is living, a sacrifice that when we do this, we will be found holy, that we will be set apart, that we are a sacrifice that is acceptable to God. In Romans 12:2, when our minds are transformed by God, then we can test his will and determine what is acceptable to him. So those two verses give us a general understanding of what it means to be accepted by God, of what we need to do to be accepted by God. We need to sacrifice ourselves, and we need to have our minds transformed. But now, let's look at how Paul uses this same word into subsequent verses. Because remember, Romans 12 is the beginning of the application portion of Romans. So from Romans 12:1 through 15:13, like we saw a couple weeks ago, this was application. Now that we move into the conclusion, where Paul's kind of initially starting his conclusion with some summarizing thoughts, here we have Paul giving us some ideas towards this acceptability. First, we see Romans 14:18, which is just a couple of paragraphs ago, really. And it says in 14:18 that those who serve Christ are found acceptable. Well, that makes sense logically. If it's also in complete harmony with Romans 12:2, because to serve Christ as he wants to be served would happen because we know God well enough to be able to seek his will and to know what he would want us to do. And one of the things that he would want us to do would be to serve Christ. So again, 14:18, those who serve Christ are acceptable to God. Now, you might also notice that 14:18 also suggests that not only does serving Christ make us acceptable to God, it also makes us approved by man. And what we should understand from approved by man, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to like us, everybody's going to approve of what we do. We certainly know that Christians are persecuted for their faith and such. But Paul was writing to the church, and he was writing about the church. And so as we are seeking out God, as we are seeking to better understand his will for us, others in the church will approve that happening. So that is one. The second idea, and we find it in this passage this week, is from Romans 15:16. And here again, Paul talks about being accepted. In this verse specifically, the reference is about the Gentiles being an offering, and specifically a kind of priestly offering that was offered by Paul. Now, when I say a priestly offering offered by Paul, this has Old Testament roots. Now, of course, the Gentiles weren't offering offerings in the Old Testament, at least not to the one true God. Very few of them did that. They had their own pagan gods. But Paul was acting like an Old Testament priest in the sense that, if you recall, the people would bring their animals to the priest, who would butcher and slaughter, and part of it would be done for this, and part of the animal would be used for this, or part of the grain offering, whatever it was. That would be sacrificed not by the person, they gave it up, but the priest was the one who was kind of interceding to God. And of course, Jesus is our intercessor at this point. But if we compare this idea of offering, then look back to 12:1, where we are to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. The people brought a living animal to the priest to offer before God so that the sins would be forgiven. Here we find that acceptable to God means that we, in Romans 12:1, that we bring ourselves to God as a living sacrifice. Not that He kills us, but that we have died to self so that we might live for Him. But here it is Paul saying that the Gentiles become a acceptable offering because of Paul's ministry to them and sharing the gospel and helping them to know about Jesus. They are becoming a living and holy sacrifice. So Paul begins the conclusion of this letter by reminding the reader what we have been taught just very recently in this letter, right here from Scripture as well. We become acceptable to God not because of what we are doing, but because of our faith, and our faith then leading us to do other things like serve Christ, like offering ourselves as a sacrifice. So we can see this further from Hebrews 11:6, for instance. Hebrews 11:6 reminds us that without faith, it is impossible to please God. We can do lots of stuff, lots of good stuff, lots of great stuff, help a lot of people, love others. But without faith, it is impossible to please, or let me substitute please with to be acceptable to God. We cannot be acceptable to Him apart from faith. But if we have faith, then we will want to serve Him, and through that faith and through that service, we become acceptable to Him. And that leads us to hearing the words that we should all long to hear from Matthew 25:21 and a couple other verses. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy, acceptable. He's joyous about this. Enter into the joy of your master. So if you want to be acceptable to God, it begins with faith. But then it does continue with service. As James, the brother of Jesus, wrote in James 1:22, that we are not to just be hearers of the word, but we are to be doers of the word as well. So let us be a people that is not only a people who say that we believe, but let others find in us a people who show we believe by the things that we do, not just by our worship of God alone.